Today our story is how Cleopatra seduced two Roman generals. Imagine being so intelligent, so calculating, and so aware of your own power that you could bend the mightiest empire on earth to your will, without ever commanding a single army. This is the story of Cleopatra VII, a woman who spoke 9 languages, understood statecraft better than seasoned generals, and orchestrated the fall of republics using nothing but her intellect, her charm, and an understanding of human nature that would make modern psychologists jealous. She didn't just seduce 2 of Rome's most powerful generals. She weaponized their ambitions against Rome itself, and in doing so she changed the course of Western civilization. But here's what most people get wrong about her. It wasn't magic. It wasn't beauty. It was strategy so brilliant that it still influences global politics today. Stay with us as we uncover the real Cleopatra, the woman history forgot to tell you about. Please, like and subscribe our videos to more informative and historic stories. How Cleopatra VII leveraged Roman ambition to save Egypt. Story 1. The woman behind the crown. Cleopatra's rise to power and her strategic genius. Why 2. When Caesar met Cleopatra, the political union that shook Rome. Story 1. The woman behind the crown, the making of a strategist. Picture Alexandria in 69 BCE. You're standing in one of the ancient world's greatest cities, place where Greek scholars debate philosophy in the Great Library, where merchants from 3 continents crowd the harbor, and where the Nile River deposits its annual blessing of fertile soil. But if you venture into the royal palace, you would find something far more complex than beauty or luxury. You would find a family in chaos. This is where Cleopatra VII Philopator was born. Her name meant glory of the father, and it was perhaps the only gift her father would give her that didn't come wrapped in betrayal. Her father was Ptolemy Duhain Aulitz, a name that translates to the flute player, a nickname earned not from musical talent, but from his unpopularity with the Egyptian people and his dependence on Rome. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand the impossible world she was born into. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra arrived. Her ancestors had been Greek generals who served under Alexander the Great. And when Alexander's empire fractured after his death, Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy I. For 13 generations, her family had ruled as pharaohs, yet they were not Egyptian. They were Greek. They spoke Greek. They married other Greek Ptolemies. And increasingly they were becoming irrelevant. Rome had been expanding for centuries, swallowing kingdoms like a serpent swallowing prey. By the time Cleopatra was born, Rome wasn't just powerful, it was inevitable. The Ptolemaic kingdom, once mighty, now depended entirely on Rome's tolerance for its continued existence. Her father, Ptolemy VI, understood this painful reality better than most. He had traveled to Rome as a supplicant, begging the Senate to recognize his rule. He had paid enormous bribes. He had degraded himself, and Cleopatra watched all of this. But while her father reacted to Rome's power with desperation, Cleopatra observed. She studied. She learned. Her education was unlike that of most women in the ancient world. While most girls learned household management and perhaps basic writing, Cleopatra was given access to the Great Library of Alexandria, one of humanity's greatest repositories of knowledge. Here, in this vast collection of scrolls and texts, she didn't just learn languages, she learned how power actually worked. She studied philosophy with tutors trained in Greek methodology. She learned mathematics and astronomy. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasion, with the same dedication a warrior studies swordplay. Most importantly, she learned languages. By some accounts, she spoke 9 languages fluently: Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Aramaic, Parthian, and several others. But it wasn't mere linguistic talent. Each language represented access to a different world, a different way of understanding power. When you can speak the language of your enemy, you don't just understand their words, You understand their thinking. You can anticipate their desires before they recognize them themselves. Her father's reign was marked by increasing chaos. In 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was around 11 years old, a popular uprising drove her father from Egypt. He fled to Rome, where he lived in exile, continuing to beg for support. For nearly a decade, Egypt spiraled into factional warfare. Her older sister, Berenice IV, took the throne and ruled alone, a rare position for a woman in the ancient world, but one born of desperation rather than choice. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was watching her father's humiliation. She was watching how Rome operated. She was learning the ultimate lesson, that kingdoms didn't fall to armies alone. They fell to the failure of imagination. They fell to leaders who didn't understand that the world was changing, and she was beginning to understand something that would define her entire life. The rules of power were not written in stone. They were written in the margins by people clever enough to read between the lines. By her teenage years, Cleopatra had made a decision. She would not be a pawn in Rome's expanding empire. She would not plead like her father. She would not rule desperately like her sister. She would do something far more dangerous. She would become indispensable. But how do you become indispensable to the most powerful force on earth? How do you transform yourself from a minor royal in a declining kingdom into someone Rome cannot ignore? And perhaps more pressingly, what happens when the fragile power structure of Egypt collapses completely, and you're forced to make your move before you're ready? Section 2. The crisis point. The year was 51 BCE. Cleopatra was 21 years old, and everything she had spent her adolescence preparing for was about to be stripped away. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, had finally secured Roman support and returned to Egypt. With Roman backing, he reclaimed the throne, but the man who returned was not the same man who had fled. Years of exile, humiliation, and illness had broken him. He was dying, and everyone knew it. When death came in 51 BCE, the throne should have passed to Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy III. According to the will their father left behind, they were to rule jointly and marry each other, a common practice among the Ptolemies to keep the bloodline pure and prevent fragmentation of power. But here is where the reality of ancient politics reveals itself. A father's will means nothing when powerful men see an opportunity. Ptolemy XIII was only 10 years old. Cleopatra was 21. Theoretically, she should have been regent, the adult ruler who would guide her young brother until he came of age. Theoretically. But the priests and the powerful families of Alexandria had other ideas. They were uncomfortable with a woman holding power, even as regent. More importantly, they saw opportunity. A young, inexperienced boy king could be manipulated. A woman who had spent 2 decades studying power in all its forms could not. Within months of her father's death, Cleopatra was removed from power. She was not executed, not yet, but she was effectively exiled. She was sent to the Levantine coast, stripped of her titles, stripped of her access to Egypt's resources, and left with something far more dangerous than a crown: time to think. Most people in her position would have despaired. They would have accepted their fate as the inevitable outcome of being born female in a male-dominated world. But Cleopatra had spent 2 decades studying history, and history had taught her that despair was a luxury only for people without options. She had options. During her exile, she did something that might seem unremarkable on the surface, but which reveals the fundamental difference between her mind and the minds of her competitors. She built alliances. She wasn't just waiting to be restored. She was planning her return with the precision of a military campaign. She connected with her sister Arsinoe IV, who had also been pushed aside by the same power brokers who had removed Cleopatra. She cultivated relationships with the Syrian kingdom. She made strategic connections with wealthy merchants and political figures who had grievances against the current Alexandrian power structure. And most importantly, she began to understand the geopolitical reality of her world with even greater clarity. Rome was fighting a civil war. This is the crucial detail that most popular retellings of Cleopatra's life skip over, but which is absolutely central to understanding her genius. Rome in 49 BCE was not the unified force that most people imagine. The Republic was tearing itself apart. Pompey the Great, who had been Rome's supreme military commander, was in conflict with Julius Caesar, a general who had conquered Gaul and was rising rapidly in power and popularity. This civil war wasn't just a military conflict. It was a crisis of legitimacy. It was a question about the very nature of Roman power. Would Rome remain a republic governed by the Senate, or would it become an empire ruled by a single strong man? Cleopatra, watching from exile in the Levant, understood immediately what this meant for Egypt. For decades, Egyptian rulers had relied on Rome's internal stability to predict Roman behavior. You could negotiate with the Senate. You could make deals with Rome's establishment. But when Rome itself was fractured, She also understood something else that most people missed. In a civil war, the victor is not necessarily the one with the most soldiers. The victor is often the one with the most resources. Rome, for all its military might, was bleeding money. Armies needed to be fed. Supplies needed to be transported. Loyalty needed to be bought. Egypt, despite its internal chaos, was still wealthy. Its grain fed the Mediterranean. Its treasury still held vast resources. And more importantly, Egypt had something that divided Rome needed: legitimacy and stability. A kingdom at peace was far more valuable to a Roman general than a kingdom at war. By around 48 BCE, Cleopatra had begun her return. We don't have detailed accounts of exactly how she gathered her forces. History is often vague about the mundane logistics of power, but we know that she assembled an army and marched toward Egypt. Her brother and his advisors, panicked by her approach, prepared for civil war. This is where Cleopatra's patience and her long preparation became essential. Rather than attempting a direct military confrontation, which she would likely have lost, Cleopatra took a different approach. She positioned herself near the Roman territories. She made sure that the conflicts in Egypt were known to both sides of Rome's civil war. She created a situation where both Caesar and Pompey had reasons to be interested in Egyptian stability. She was, in essence, creating a power vacuum that Rome could not ignore, while simultaneously positioning herself as the solution to that vacuum. But there was a problem. A significant problem. The Roman general Pompey was losing his war against Caesar. By 48 BCE, Pompey had suffered a devastating military defeat and was fleeing toward Egypt, hoping to find refuge with Ptolemy III. Pompey had once been the most powerful man in Rome. Now he was a fugitive, and he was about to walk directly into the middle of Egypt's internal conflict. What Cleopatra didn't know yet was that Pompey's flight toward Egypt would create a cascade of consequences that would force her hand. It would push her from careful maneuvering into direct action. It would bring her face to face with a Roman general far more powerful and far more dangerous than she had anticipated, and it would set her on a path that would ultimately reshape the Mediterranean world. The question was no longer whether Cleopatra could return to power. The question was whether she could survive what was about to happen when Rome's internal warfare spilled directly into her kingdom. Section 3. The Resurrection. Pompey arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE as a broken man. Once he had been called Pompey the Great, a title earned through military victories across 3 continents. Now he was fleeing for his life, seeking shelter with a young Egyptian king who barely knew him. When Pompey reached the coast of Egypt and sent messengers to Ptolemy III requesting asylum, the young king faced a choice that would ultimately destroy him. Ptolemy III was only 18 years old, and his advisors were panic-stricken. They understood what harboring Pompey would mean. Caesar, who was currently winning Rome's civil war, would view Egypt as an enemy. But refusing Pompey would mean facing the wrath of Rome's traditional establishment, which still maintained significant power. In their terror and indecision, they made a decision that revealed how little they truly understood about power. They murdered Pompey. They executed a Roman general, a man who had once ruled Rome. They thought this would protect them. They thought it would demonstrate their loyalty to Caesar. They were catastrophically wrong, because Cleopatra, watching from her position of exile, understood immediately what this meant. Pompey's death had transformed the entire situation. It had eliminated the variable that might have complicated her calculations. And more importantly, it had created a vacuum of political legitimacy. Caesar was now the undisputed military victor in Rome's civil war. But Caesar was not in Egypt, and Caesar, despite his military genius, still needed something that only a legitimate Egyptian ruler could provide: access to Egypt's wealth and resources without the chaos of civil war. Cleopatra moved. In 48 BCE, she led her forces toward Alexandria. But she did not march as a conqueror. She moved with careful precision, positioning herself and her army in a way that made her appear not as a threat to Rome, but as a solution. When Caesar himself arrived in Alexandria shortly after her march began, pursuing Pompey and consolidating his power across the Mediterranean, he encountered a situation far more complex than he had anticipated. The young Ptolemy III, now panicked after murdering Pompey, had mobilized his forces against his sister. Egypt was on the brink of civil war. The kingdom was unstable, and standing in the midst of this chaos was a woman who spoke Latin, who understood Roman politics, and who had positioned herself with remarkable clarity as the solution to Egypt's instability. This is where the real story begins. Most accounts of the meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra focus on romantic elements, tales of seduction and passion. But the historical reality is far more subtle and far more interesting. Cleopatra did not seduce Caesar in the way popular imagination suggests. She presented him with a political problem and a political solution, wrapped in the presentation of a woman who understood his needs better than he understood them himself. She offered Caesar something Rome could not provide: a stable, wealthy, strategically positioned kingdom that would serve Rome's interests without requiring Rome to maintain a costly military occupation. She offered him an ally rather than a conquered territory, and she did this by understanding that Caesar, despite his military power, was fundamentally a political operator. He understood leverage. He understood the currency of loyalty and mutual benefit. But there was a complication. Caesar could not simply restore Cleopatra to the throne. This would appear arbitrary, a gift to a woman he had just met. For Caesar to maintain his legitimacy with Rome's Senate and people, her restoration had to appear justified. It had to appear as though her brother had forced the situation. So Cleopatra, with remarkable strategic insight, allowed herself to be protected by Caesar's forces. She positioned her brother as the aggressor. She made it appear as though Caesar was intervening to restore order and uphold the legitimate will of the previous pharaoh, which technically she was according to her father's will. The civil war that followed was brief. Ptolemy XIII, abandoned by most of his supporters once Caesar intervened, was defeated. He died in the Nile River, either from drowning in battle or from being executed. Accounts differ, but the result was the same. Cleopatra's path to power was cleared. But here is where Cleopatra's genius truly revealed itself. She did not simply thank Caesar and assume he would leave. Instead, she did something that seemed counterintuitive. She married her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was only about 13 years old at the time. This marriage served multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it satisfied the Egyptian legal and religious traditions that required the pharaoh to be married. Second, it gave her brother nominal co-rule. which satisfied those in Egypt who were uncomfortable with a woman ruling alone. Third, and most crucially, it meant that any son she bore would have undisputed claim to the Egyptian throne, and would be half Roman, half Egyptian, creating a permanent bond between Egypt and Rome. When she became pregnant with Caesar's son, a child she would name Caesarion, she had accomplished something that seemed impossible just years before. She had transformed herself from an exiled princess into the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean world, and she had done it not through force of arms, but through understanding the true mechanics of power. But here is the question that haunted her, and that would define the next chapter of her life. How long would Caesar live? And what would happen to her and to Egypt when the most powerful man in Rome was no longer there to guarantee her position? By 44 BCE, Cleopatra had her answer. Caesar was assassinated by members of the Roman Senate who feared his growing power. In a single moment, the man who had secured her throne was dead, and Cleopatra, now with a young son and a kingdom that depended on Roman support, had to make a choice. She could retreat. She could consolidate her power in Egypt and hope that Rome's next leader would respect the arrangement Caesar had made. Or she could do what she had always done. She could study the new power structure in Rome, understand the ambitions of the men competing for dominance, and position herself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a strategic player in a much larger game. She chose the latter. And this choice would lead her to another Roman general, a man named Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony. Where Caesar had been the calculating military genius, Antony was ambitious in a way that Cleopatra could exploit. And unlike Caesar, Antony was not a man who needed to maintain the fiction of republican legitimacy. What Cleopatra understood in those years after Caesar's death was that the real game was just beginning. Rome had not finished tearing itself apart, and Egypt's role in that ongoing conflict was far from over. Story 2. When Caesar met Cleopatra, the political union that shook Rome. Section 1. The meeting. To truly understand the meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra, you must first understand the man who walked into Alexandria in 48 BCE. Julius Caesar was not simply a military commander. He was a political phenomenon, a man who had achieved something that Rome's Senate had worked for centuries to prevent: the concentration of ultimate power in a single person. By 48 BCE, Caesar had already conquered Gaul, a territory roughly equivalent to modern-day France. He had defeated the Germanic tribes. He had crossed the Rhine into German territory. He had brought more land under Rome's control than any general in a generation. But more importantly, he had done something that terrified Rome's traditional aristocracy. He had built an army that was loyal to him personally, not to Rome as an institution. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This was, to the Senate's way of thinking, the end of everything Rome stood for. The conflict between Caesar and Pompey the Great had erupted precisely because of this threat. Pompey represented the old system, a general who served Rome's Senate even if he wielded enormous power. Caesar represented something new, a general who commanded loyalty that transcended institutional loyalty. His soldiers would follow him anywhere. They would die for him, and they would, if necessary, fight against Rome itself. By 48 BCE, that civil war was essentially over. Caesar had won. But winning a civil war is far simpler than the task that follows: consolidating power in a way that doesn't invite immediate counter-rebellion. Caesar needed stability. He needed resources. He needed to demonstrate to Rome that his victory had not been Pyrrhic, that his rule would bring order and prosperity, not chaos and warfare. Egypt represented all of these things simultaneously. It was stable. It was wealthy. It was strategically positioned, and it was currently in the process of tearing itself apart. When Caesar's forces arrived in Alexandria, They encountered a city that was perhaps the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Alexandria had been founded by Alexander the Great nearly 300 years before, and it had been designed as a cosmopolitan center. Its harbor was one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Its streets were laid out in a grid pattern, a revolutionary concept in ancient urban planning. Its great library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls and manuscripts, and its population was a mixture of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other populations, all engaged in trade and intellectual exchange. But behind the sophistication and wealth lay political chaos. The young Ptolemy XIII, now 18 years old, was being manipulated by a council of regents who had their own competing interests. Cleopatra, exiled and building her forces outside the city, represented a threat to their power. Pompey's murder had created a diplomatic crisis, and Rome's arrival, in the form of Julius Caesar himself, had transformed a domestic political struggle into an international crisis. When Caesar requested to meet with the young king, Ptolemy XIII complied, though with considerable anxiety. What Caesar wanted was information. What did Egypt's leadership want? What were the factions within Egypt's power structure? And most importantly, what leverage did Caesar have? What Caesar encountered in his initial meetings was a young man who was intellectually capable, but politically outmatched. Ptolemy III was surrounded by advisors who wanted nothing more than to tell Caesar what he wanted to hear. The result was predictable. Caesar recognized that the young king was not the real power in Egypt. Real power lay somewhere else. And then, Cleopatra made her move. The exact circumstances of her entry into Alexandria remain somewhat mysterious. Historical accounts vary. Some sources suggest she was smuggled into Caesar's quarters hidden in a carpet or a laundry basket. Other accounts suggest she simply walked through the city disguised. What matters is not the method but the message. Cleopatra was willing to take extraordinary risks to meet with Caesar personally. When she entered his presence, Caesar encountered something he had not anticipated. A woman who was not simpering, not pleading, not performing the role of a desperate supplicant. Instead, he encountered a woman who spoke his language, literally. She spoke Latin, which was rare among Egyptian royalty, and who clearly understood Rome's political situation as well as he did. Cleopatra did not waste time with flattery or feminine wiles. Instead, she presented a logical argument. She explained to Caesar that Egypt's instability threatened Rome's interests. She explained that her brother's advisors were incompetent and potentially hostile to Rome. She explained that she, as the elder child and the one with a legitimate claim to the throne according to her father's will, could provide Caesar with a stable, cooperative partner in Egypt. But here is the crucial detail that reveals Cleopatra's genius. She did not ask Caesar to remove her brother. She did not ask him to restore her forcibly. Instead, she asked him to observe the situation with clear eyes. She asked him to see for himself that Egypt needed competent leadership, and she positioned herself as the solution, not through emotional manipulation but through logical argument. Caesar, a man who prided himself on his intelligence and his clear-eyed assessment of political situations, found himself impressed. Here was a woman who understood power the way he understood power. Here was a woman who could be useful. But there was a problem with this conversation. A significant problem. If Ptolemy XIII discovered that his sister had met secretly with Caesar, it would appear to be a conspiracy. It would appear as though Caesar and Cleopatra were plotting against him, and in a sense they were. But in the world of ancient politics, such things needed to be deniable. They needed to appear as inevitable consequences of circumstance, rather than as the result of deliberate plotting. So Cleopatra, with remarkable political acumen, allowed the situation to escalate. She positioned her forces closer to Alexandria. She made it clear that she intended to reclaim her throne. She gave her brother and his advisors a reason to act. They moved against her, which gave Caesar justification to intervene. What followed was not a seduction. It was a political negotiation conducted in the language of power. Caesar intervened to restore order. Cleopatra was restored to her rightful place. And in the process, a partnership was formed that would reshape the Mediterranean world. But what neither Cleopatra nor Caesar fully understood in that moment was how their alliance would reverberate through Rome itself. There were powerful men in Rome who saw Caesar's growing power as a threat, and those men were watching Egypt carefully. What would happen when Caesar's enemies decided that Cleopatra was not just Caesar's ally, but a symbol of his threat to Roman republican values? And how would Cleopatra navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics when Rome itself was fundamentally divided about what kind of government it wanted to be? Section 2. The Consequences, Deepening the Political Intrigue. The alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra was not a secret. In fact, it was impossible to hide. Within weeks of Caesar's intervention in Egypt's civil war, rumors had spread throughout Rome. Caesar had restored a foreign queen to power. Caesar was spending time in Alexandria. Caesar had taken an Egyptian lover. And more troublingly for Rome's conservative faction, Caesar seemed to show no sign of returning to Rome to consolidate his political position. In Rome, power abhors a vacuum. And Caesar, by lingering in Egypt, had created precisely that. To understand the political earthquake that Cleopatra inadvertently triggered in Rome, you must understand the nature of Roman politics in 48 BCE. Rome was technically still a republic, governed by a senate of aristocratic families. But the reality was far more complex. Rome had become a place where military power translated directly into political power. A general who commanded the loyalty of armies could dictate terms to the Senate. A general without armies was merely another senator among many. Caesar understood this. But there were others in Rome who understood it equally well, and who were watching Caesar's movements with mounting alarm. Chief among these was Pompey's faction, the senators and generals who had supported Pompey in the civil war and who had fled to various parts of the Mediterranean after his defeat. These men were not defeated. They were merely displaced. They maintained control over parts of North Africa, Spain, and other Roman territories, and they were gathering their strength, waiting for an opportunity to strike back at Caesar. But there was another, more immediate threat to Caesar's position: the Senate itself, or more specifically, the senators who feared that Caesar's extended absence from Rome would eventually lead to the rise of a rival general. If Caesar stayed in Egypt long enough, another ambitious general might consolidate power in Rome and emerge as a counterweight to Caesar's influence. This is where the political marriage, the literal marriage between Caesar and Cleopatra's interests began to create unintended consequences. Cleopatra, for her part, was acutely aware of these dynamics. She had spent her entire life studying how power worked, and she understood that Rome's political system was fundamentally different from Egypt's. In Egypt, power flowed from the pharaoh outward. The pharaoh was both a political and a religious figure. Rome was the opposite. Rome's authority was distributed among competing power centers. The Senate competed with the generals. The generals competed with each other. Individual aristocratic families competed for prestige and resources. And increasingly ambitious men competed to reshape Rome's entire system of government. When Cleopatra bore Caesar's son in 47 BCE, a child she named Caesarion, literally Little Caesar, she had accomplished something profound. She had created a permanent biological link between Egypt and Rome's supreme military power. But she had also done something that terrified Rome's Senate. She had created an heir who represented a potential dynasty. She had created the possibility that Caesar's power might not end with his death, but might be inherited by his son. This was precisely what Rome's republican system was designed to prevent. The Senate had built checks and balances specifically to ensure that no single family could accumulate dynastic Power across generations. Magistrates served limited terms. Military commands were limited in duration. Authority was deliberately fragmented to prevent exactly the kind of consolidation that Caesar was now achieving. And Cleopatra, whether she fully understood it or not, had placed her hand on the scales in a way that tipped Roman politics toward fundamental instability. What made this situation even more fraught was the nature of Caesar's political position. Caesar was not the king of Rome. He held the title of dictator, a position that was theoretically temporary, designed to give one person emergency powers during times of crisis. But Caesar kept renewing this position. He kept extending his authority. And increasingly, senators who had once supported him began to see him not as a temporary emergency measure, but as a permanent threat to their power. The birth of Caesarion added fuel to this fire. If Caesar could pass his power to his son, then Rome's system of government would fundamentally change. The Republic would become an empire, and the aristocratic families who had shared power for centuries would find themselves subordinate to a dynasty. This is the context in which we must understand the famous phrase, et tu, Brute. The words Caesar supposedly spoke when he was assassinated. The assassination was not simply a murder. It was a political act. It was the Senate's attempt to prevent the transformation of Rome from a republic governed by multiple power centers to an empire governed by a single dynasty. But here is where Cleopatra's strategic positioning becomes even more relevant. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, she was in Rome. She was there to meet with Caesar and to cement the alliance between Egypt and Rome. She was there to ensure that Caesarion's legitimacy was recognized, and she was there when everything fell apart. The assassination created a power vacuum in Rome that was even more destabilizing than Caesar's dominance had been. With Caesar dead, multiple ambitious generals, Mark Antony, Octavian, who would later be called Augustus, and others, immediately began maneuvering to consolidate power for themselves. What Cleopatra understood, in those chaotic months after Caesar's death, was that Rome's civil war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Caesar's death had not resolved the fundamental tension between Rome's republican system and the rise of military strongmen. It had simply postponed the resolution, and Egypt, as a wealthy kingdom with strategic importance, was about to become a prize that multiple Roman factions would fight to control. The senators who had orchestrated Caesar's assassination believed that his death would restore the Republic. They believed that without Caesar, Rome would return to its traditional system of shared power and senatorial government. But they were catastrophically wrong. What Caesar's death actually created was a period of chaos in which multiple powerful men competed for his position. Mark Antony, who had been Caesar's closest ally, immediately moved to consolidate Caesar's legacy. Octavian, who was only 18 years old but who had been designated as Caesar's adopted heir in his will, also maneuvered for power. And gradually, the conflict between these two men, Antony and Octavian, would come to define the next phase of Rome's political history. For Cleopatra, this created both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis was obvious. Without Caesar to protect Egypt, the kingdom was vulnerable. Antony and Octavian were both fighting for control of the Mediterranean, and Egypt's wealth and strategic position made it a vital prize. But the opportunity was equally significant. Cleopatra understood something that Rome's politicians often missed. In times of chaos, a kingdom that maintains internal stability and possesses resources becomes extraordinarily valuable. She could not compete militarily with Rome, but she could provide something that Rome desperately needed: legitimacy, wealth, and a stable base of operations. And she understood, from studying how power worked, that the man who could best use Egypt's resources, who could best channel Egypt's wealth into building the military force necessary to consolidate power in Rome would be the victor in Rome's ongoing civil war. The question was, which of Rome's ambitious generals would Cleopatra choose to support? And more importantly, what price could she extract for that support? Because this time, Cleopatra was not a young woman desperate to reclaim a throne. She was the recognized pharaoh of Egypt, the mother of Caesar's son, and a woman who understood power with a clarity that few people in the ancient world could match. She was about to make a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the Mediterranean world itself. But first, she needed to understand the true ambitions of Rome's competing factions. She needed to calculate which man represented the best opportunity for Egypt's survival and prosperity. And she was about to meet a man named Marcus Antonius Mark Antony, a general whose ambitions and whose weaknesses would create a partnership unlike anything the ancient world had previously seen. What neither Cleopatra nor Antony understood in that moment was that their alliance would ultimately represent the last great struggle between Rome's old Mediterranean order and Rome's new imperial system. Their partnership would shake empires. It would reshape trade routes, and it would set the stage for a showdown that would determine whether Rome would be ruled by one man or by an oligarchy. Section 3, the aftermath and the new alliance building. Toward the culmination of both stories, 41 BCE, 3 years after Caesar's assassination, the map of Roman power had shifted dramatically. The Senate's attempt to restore the Republic through Caesar's murder had failed spectacularly. Instead of stabilizing Rome, the assassination had triggered a new and even more brutal civil war. Multiple factions competed for dominance, former allies turned into bitter enemies, and across the Mediterranean, ambitious men gathered armies and resources, each believing he could emerge as the ultimate victor. But something fundamental had changed since Caesar's time. The ideological struggle about Rome's system of government had largely been resolved. Rome would no longer be a republic in any meaningful sense. It would be an empire. The only question now was, who would be the emperor? Enter Mark Antony. Marcus Antonius was Caesar's cousin and his most trusted general. Unlike Caesar, who had cultivated an image of austere military genius, Antony was openly ambitious in ways that bordered on theatrical. He loved luxury. He enjoyed wine, women, and the pleasures of the Mediterranean. He was generous with his soldiers to the point of extravagance. And he possessed a charisma that made men want to follow him not out of fear, but out of genuine affection. In many ways, Antony was everything that Rome's conservative faction feared in a leader. But for precisely this reason, he was also tremendously popular with the soldiers and with the common people of Rome. Where Caesar had been feared and respected, Antony was beloved. By 41 BCE, Antony had consolidated significant power in the eastern Mediterranean. He controlled armies, he controlled territories, and he was preparing for the inevitable showdown with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who controlled the western Mediterranean and Italy itself. Antony needed resources. Massive resources. Egypt, with its vast wealth and its ability to supply grain and other goods necessary for maintaining armies, was exactly what he needed. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in 41 BCE, he was not summoning her as an equal. He was summoning her as a subordinate. Rome had conquered Egypt centuries before in any practical sense. Egypt maintained nominal independence, but everyone understood that Egypt's existence depended on Rome's tolerance. Antony expected Cleopatra to come to him obediently, perhaps bearing gifts and tribute, ready to negotiate the terms by which Egypt would support Rome's military efforts in exchange for nominal independence. What Antony received instead was a demonstration of political theater that has echoed through history for over 2,000 years. Cleopatra arrived in Tarsus not in a military vessel or a simple diplomatic barge. She arrived in a ship that was a floating palace, covered in gold and silks with sails dyed purple, a color reserved in the ancient world for emperors and gods. She was accompanied by a retinue of attendants and musicians, and she arranged her entrance with the precision of. According to historical accounts, Antony was so impressed, some say overwhelmed by this display, that he immediately agreed to meet with her privately. And in that private meeting, something remarkable happened. Cleopatra did not seduce Antony in any obvious way, but she did something far more sophisticated. She presented herself to him as an equal. She spoke to him in his own language, Latin. She discussed Rome's political situation with the kind of insight that revealed she understood it as well as he did. She made clear that Egypt's support would not be a gift granted to Rome by a subordinate state, but rather a partnership between two powers that needed each other. And crucially, she made Antony understand that while Egypt needed Rome's military might to ensure its survival against Rome's other factions, Rome needed Egypt's resources and Egypt's strategic position in ways that Rome could not simply demand or conquer without great cost. What emerged from these meetings was not a relationship of conquest, but of mutual benefit, and over the following years what had begun as a political alliance transformed into something far more complex. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children. They were married, a marriage that Egypt recognized fully, though Rome's establishment would later use this marriage as evidence of Antony's going native and betraying Roman values. Cleopatra and Antony created a partnership in which Egyptian gold funded Roman armies, and Roman military might protected Egyptian independence. But this alliance came at tremendous cost. Octavian, watching from Rome, saw in Antony and Cleopatra a threat to his own consolidation of power. And gradually, through a combination of military maneuvering and propaganda, Octavian began to isolate Antony. He portrayed Antony as a man corrupted by Eastern luxury, a man who had abandoned Rome for Egypt. He spread rumors that Antony intended to move Rome's capital to Alexandria. He created a narrative in which Cleopatra was not a strategic partner, but a seductress who had ensnared Rome's greatest general and turned him against his own people. By 31 BCE, war between Octavian and Antony was inevitable. It came to a head at the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. This battle would determine the future not just of Rome, but of the entire Mediterranean world. What happened at Actium was not a decisive military victory in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a rout. Antony's fleet was defeated. His soldiers, demoralized or convinced by Octavian's propaganda that their cause was lost, abandoned him. The defeat was so complete that Antony, seeing all was lost, fled back to Egypt. It was the end of an era. The last moment in which a man other than Octavian could seriously challenge for supreme power in Rome had passed. Cleopatra, understanding immediately what Actium meant, faced a choice. She could attempt to continue resistance. She could try to negotiate with Octavian, or she could do what she had done once before when facing impossible circumstances. She could make a dramatic gesture that would preserve her memory and her dignity. Cleopatra chose the third option. When Octavian's forces entered Egypt in 30 BCE, they found the queen dead. The exact circumstances of her death remain debated by historians. Some accounts suggest she took her own life, possibly by snake venom. Others suggest she died of illness or at the hands of Octavian's forces. What matters historically is not the method, but the meaning. Cleopatra's life as an independent ruler had ended. Egypt became a direct province of Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, ended with Cleopatra's death. Rome's transformation from republic to empire was complete. But here is what makes Cleopatra's story more than simply a tale of political failure. The legacy she left behind shaped the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. When Octavian, who took the title Augustus and became Rome's first emperor consolidated power. He did not simply erase Cleopatra or her influence. Instead, he incorporated her vision. Augustus maintained Egypt's status as a vital source of grain and wealth. He recognized the importance of the eastern Mediterranean trade routes that Cleopatra had understood so clearly. He built an empire that was in many ways based on the same principles that Cleopatra had pioneered. The integration of different cultures under a single system of governance, maintained not through constant warfare, but through mutual benefit and strategic interdependence. Cleopatra had failed to prevent Rome's dominance. But she had succeeded in shaping how that dominance would function. She had transformed the relationship between Rome and the Mediterranean world from one of pure conquest to one of strategic partnership. She had demonstrated that a smaller power, if led by someone of sufficient intelligence and strategic clarity, could influence the behavior of much larger powers through understanding and leveraging their own internal dynamics. In the modern world, we see echoes of Cleopatra's approach everywhere. Small nations negotiate with superpowers by understanding those superpowers' internal political dynamics, and by positioning themselves as valuable partners rather than conquered territories. Individuals with limited formal power accumulate influence through strategic intelligence and the cultivation of relationships. Leaders who understand that perception and positioning often matter more than raw force find ways to punch above their weight. Cleopatra's ultimate defeat was not a failure of her method. It was a failure of circumstance. No strategy, no matter how brilliant, can overcome the sheer material force of an enemy with greater resources and determination. But what Cleopatra demonstrated across her lifetime was something far more enduring than any single political victory. She demonstrated that power is not fixed, that it can be accumulated through intelligence and understanding, and that a person born into unfavorable circumstances can reshape their destiny through clarity of vision and ruthless commitment to strategic thinking. 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains a figure of fascination not because she was beautiful or seductive, but because she was brilliant. She understood power, how it worked, how it could be leveraged, and how it could be transmitted from one person to another through bonds of mutual interest rather than through force alone. In the end, Cleopatra could not save Egypt from Rome, but she saved something perhaps more valuable. She saved Egypt's dignity. She ensured that Egypt was not simply conquered, but recognized, and she left behind a legacy that would influence how empires function and how smaller powers survive within them for the rest of human history. The woman who seduced. 2 Roman generals did not do so through beauty or femininity. She seduced them through intelligence, through understanding their deepest ambitions and fears, and through positioning herself as indispensable to their success. And in doing so, she revealed one of history's most enduring truths, that the most powerful weapon is not the sword or the army, but the clarity of understanding how power actually works.